Good afternoon, brothers and sisters in Christ. Welcome back to another discussion rooted in Genesis. In this case, it's what about these old ages that I keep hearing about? Whether it's the old age of the earth, the old age of the universe, the old age of the creation itself, the old age of man, the old age of some animals, whatever it is, what about, Rich, those old ages? Great question. If you've been following along here in Genesis, even starting in the introduction, it's clear that the Bible paints the picture that the earth, the creation, the cosmos, everything is very young. In fact, when we look at the dates that were provided, we get anywhere from a maximum, a very outside range of about 10,000 down to a little over 6,000. So we're never going to get anything close to millions or indeed billions of years for any of this. Really what we're looking at is somewhere in the range of a low end of, let's say, 6,000, low sixes, to a high end in 10,000. And really this began right in our introduction as we looked at the timeline that Genesis provides. Well, we're already out to just a little under 2,000 years from the creation to Abraham. And Abraham is, just to sort of lock it in your mind, rough numbers, roughly 2,000 years before Jesus. So this gets pretty hard to shoehorn in hundreds of thousands, millions, or indeed billions. It does get much clearer when you're looking at an age, again, a little over 6,000 to a max of 10,000. And that's the timeline that the Bible would paint if taken literally. Even if you look at the New Testament, the genealogies are recorded by both Matthew and Luke. Again, you can insert some of the missing kings in Matthew's lineage, and there's no doubt that there are a couple missing. We know that. We know who they are. But equally, you're not going to get an age of hundreds of thousands, millions, or billions. You're going to get an age of, again, somewhere a little over 6,000 to a max end of 10,000. So as you think about this, the biblical timeline looks something like this. Creation on day one, in the 6 days of creation, and everything is created during those days. Man is created, all the animals are created, everything, the stars are created, our sun is created, our moon is created, everything is created during those days. 1,656 years later, we have the flood. Roughly 2,730 years later, we have the law. Roughly 4,250 years later, the cross, and that introduces the church age where we're living now. And again, we're talking a little over 6,000 to a max end of 10,000. This is very different than the evolutionary or the evolutionist timeline, which has the Big Bang 13.7 billion years ago, first stars forming 13.2 billion years ago, or essentially 500 million years later, galaxies forming 11 to 8 billion years, Milky Way 9 to 7 billion years, the Earth 4 to 6 billion years. Life appears roughly 3.5 billion years ago here on the planet, where we would argue life appeared between, let's just use rough numbers, 6,200 years and 10,000 years. Now, already these numbers are in jeopardy. We're already looking back at stars that we believe are at least 13.5 billion years old. So we're already looking back to a point that is older than we believe stars could have formed in the current evolutionary model. It's worse than that. We're already seeing those stars in galaxies. Already the beliefs of galaxy formation are completely imploding and exploding. If we hold to this timeline, galaxies are forming almost instantly after the Big Bang. But there's another problem. And again, I don't want to talk about all these problems. I've already talked about some of these things. I don't want to get into it, but I just want you to hear it again. We should, as we look that far back in time, we shouldn't even see stars at 13.5, but let's pretend we do. They would be first generation stars, principally helium and hydrogen. That's not what we're seeing. We're seeing third generation stars. So this whole model is going to have to be revamped. It's just a matter of time. The weight is already collapsing it. They will double, if not more, this entire timeline in the coming years. That'll be very disruptive to evolutionary science, but they do this quite regularly. They'll survive and continue thriving in spite of doubling. Like 13.7 is nothing. We're going to go to 26 or 28 or even beyond, billion years old. But again, this is just the nature of evolutionary science. But it's important to understand that science does not produce ages. If we push science for the age of people or things, we must remember science doesn't produce ages, so therefore it has limitations. It can potentially produce a min, max, or range estimate. But even when it does that, it makes assumptions about the past that must hold true for that entire period for that prediction to be reliable. The more the assumptions vary, or the more you move away from those assumptions, the more radical the output, the results can become. So as the assumptions are violated, the age becomes completely erroneous. And that's what's happened with modern science. So before we advance any further, let's talk about dating fossils, because typically that's most of the time what we hear about. This guy lived, 500,000 years ago, this guy lived 2 million years ago, etc. So when it comes to dating fossils, it's important for you to understand that fossils are rarely dated by radiometric dating techniques. That may be a surprise to you. You probably would have assumed they're always dated by radiometric dating techniques. Well, in truth, the fossils themselves cannot be dated that way. They would, if there's any chance they'll provide a date, it would be carbon-14 dating, not radiometric dating. Carbon-14 dating is the method that works on organic materials. But there's problems with carbon-14 dating. It cannot produce a date older than about 60,000 years, so they'll never carbon date a fossil or fossilific materials, because the date would be either infinity, in other words, no date at all, there's no radioactive carbon, or some date less than essentially 60,000 years old. So they're never going to use carbon-14 dating. We'll talk more about carbon-14 dating another time. And the standard radiometric dating techniques, which we'll talk about in a moment, can only be used for igneous and metamorphic rock. Can't be used for sedimentary rock like sandstone, limestone, or shale, and it cannot be used for organic materials like trees, like grasses, and like all life forms. So fossils are rarely dated by radiometric dating techniques. Sometimes they'll date like a lava flow that's below the fossil or above the fossil, or maybe on each side, and they'll set the date range using radiometric dating techniques. But the fossils themselves are not dated using radiometric dating techniques. So where do these old edges come from? That's a great question. So as I alluded to already, two places. The first one I talked about, radiometric dating techniques of surrounding features or strata. In this case, like if the skeletal remains were to be found between two lava flows, they would use those two lava flows through radiometric dating to bracket when that those fossil remains would have been formed between those two lava flows. Or if similar strata in a nearby area, they might do the same thing. But the more common way, or maybe the most common way, it seems to me, is the geologic column, which we'll talk about in a moment, or the supposed evolution of man. So if we're talking about, dinosaurs and things like that, trilobites, going back even further, we'll use when we believe those things existed and index fossils from those areas to really date those things. Now that's, as you'll find, very circular reasoning. And then equally the supposed evolution of man. So if we know this is a, pick your Australopithecus afarensis, then we'll use the rough dates that we believe that animal roamed the planet. So it becomes the ever-fulfilling prophecy. We've decided when this thing lived, and so now we're just driving all outcomes to that date. It really is that bizarre and that simplistic. But let's advance the argument with the question, what is radiometric dating and how does it work? So we've talked about it, I've introduced it, but that's even a better question. And so to do that, this first video is from Answers in Genesis. This is a basic discussion of radiometric dating, and we'll build from here. So I've got two videos back to back, but again, the goal will be for you to kind of enjoy these and pick up the basics of how radiometric dating works.
Nearly every textbook and science magazine teaches that the Earth is billions of years old, and the primary dating method used for determining this is what is called radioisotope dating, or radiometric dating. Now, this is a reliable method for measuring absolute ages of rocks and the age of the Earth, right? First off, many scientists now regard the age of the Earth to be between 4.55 and 4.6 billion years old. Okay, So if this method is reliable and accurate, why the 50 million year discrepancy? That seems like a lot. But let's get into some details here and see what's going on. Keep in mind that there's all kinds of scientific jargon on this topic, and so we'll just present a very straightforward, simplified version of the process. Radiometric dating is the process of estimating the ages of rocks based on the decay of radioactive elements in them. Basically, there are certain kinds of atoms in nature that are unstable and spontaneously decay into other kinds of atoms. For instance, uranium will radioactively decay through a series of steps until it becomes the stable element called lead. The original element is called the parent element, and the end result is called the daughter element. Radioisotope dating is commonly used to date igneous rocks, rocks which formed when hot molten material cooled and solidified. The dating clock started when the rock cooled. During the molten state, it is assumed that the intense heat forced any gaseous daughter elements to escape. It is assumed that once the rock cooled, no more atoms escaped, and any daughter element now found in the rock is a result of radioactive decay since that rock formed. The decay rate is measured in terms of half-life. That is the length of time it takes half of the remaining atoms of a radioactive parent element to decay. Now, of course, that can be measured in a laboratory, and it is assumed that since we know the decay rate, we can calculate backwards and come up with the age of the rock. But is that all there is to it? Here's where it gets tricky. It's true we can measure a decay rate using observational science, but there's another kind of science that is required to accurately calculate dates for rocks, and that is what we call historical science. Historical science deals with the things in the past, and therefore it cannot be repeated and tested. Dating methods require both types of science, because in order to get accurate rock dates, one would have to accurately know both the decay rate and the initial conditions of the rock sample, right? Since radioisotope dating uses both types of science, we can't directly measure the ages of rocks. There are assumptions involved. For instance, how do we know what the initial conditions were in the rock sample? How do we know the amounts of parent or daughter elements now in that sample haven't been altered by other processes in the past? How does someone know the decay rate has remained constant since the rock formed? The answer is they don't. Let's simplify here and talk about a typical hourglass. Let's say you walk into a room and you see an hourglass with sand at the top and sand at the bottom, and some sand sprinkling from the top chamber to the bottom. Well, observational science would allow us to see and measure the sand, and then calculate how long the hourglass has been running, right? We could make our sand measurements and then calculate when the hourglass was turned over, right? Well, those calculations could be wrong, because we may have failed to consider some major assumptions, like, was there any sand at the bottom when the hourglass was turned over? Has any sand been added or taken out of the hourglass? Has the sand always been falling at a constant rate? Since we did not observe the initial conditions when the hourglass started, and we haven't been watching the sand all the time since then, we must make assumptions. All three of those assumptions can affect our time calculations. Now, of course, there's more to understanding all of this, but enough said.
So hopefully that gave you a basic understanding of radiometric dating. This next video is from the DVD Evolution's Achilles Heels. This is Dr. Jim Mason and Dr. Jonathan Safadi on radiometric dating. So we'll review some of the stuff you talked about, really making sure that this is clear in your mind exactly what it is. But we're talking about the parent elements, which are radioactive, over time converting to the daughter elements. And we're talking about the assumptions that when the rock was formed, whenever it was heated and then ultimately cooled, it started out with 0 daughter elements. So it was all parent elements, and all of the daughter elements you see when you look at it now are from decay, thus the time can be accurately measured. So let's one more video on radiometric dating, and then we'll move from there.
Many people are of the opinion that scientists can make direct measurements using these techniques of billions of years ages for rocks. And they use this then to discredit the history of the Bible. And this is really not the case. The physics behind radiometric dating is relatively straightforward. We have a radioactive element called a parent, which transforms over time into a non-radioactive element called the daughter. And this happens with a characteristic rate referred to as a half-life. That's the length of time that it takes half the parent element to transform into an equal amount of the daughter element. So over time, the amount of parent in the rock decreases and the amount of daughter in the rock increases. The scientists can use very powerful machines to measure either directly the amounts of these two elements or their ratio, and this ratio then can be used in a theoretical calculation along with the half-life to calculate an alleged age for the sample. Let me give you some examples. Radioactive carbon-14 decays to nitrogen-14. Uranium decays to lead. Potassium-40 decays to argon-40. And all of these are used in radiometric dating.
We don't actually measure the age with these methods. We actually are measuring the amount of these isotopes in the rocks or fossils. And it's an interpretation using certain assumptions about these amounts that give us the age. But the age is actually not measured directly.
For many radiometric dating techniques, one of the assumptions is that there is no daughter element present in the rock when it is formed, which of course we can't know unless we're actually there and can take a sample of the rock immediately after it was formed and do an analysis. Now, a small amount of daughter present at the time the rock is formed, if the rock is actually billions of years old, will not have a very significant impact on the calculated age. But if the rock is actually only a few thousand years old, even a very, very tiny amount of daughter present at the time the rock is formed will have a huge impact and give the rock appearances of being billions of years old. Another assumption in radiometric dating is that the rate at which the parent element transforms to the daughter element has been constant over time. Now, this has generally been borne out by experiments in the past, but recently some scientists in the US and Europe determined that the transformation rate of at least some elements, notably cobalt-60, cesium-137, silicon-32, and radium-226, do indeed vary with time. Now, they don't understand why this is, but they have noted that the rate varies with the distance between the Earth and the Sun. Now, the importance of this with respect to radiometric dating is that the assumption that the transformation rate is constant is clearly not true in the short term, and therefore may well be not true in the long term, which of course would invalidate the calculated ages. Some additional evidence for this is an experiment that was spearheaded by the Institute for Creation Research, in which some scientists found zircon crystals with unexpectedly large amounts of helium in them. Now, helium is a byproduct of the decay of uranium-238 to lead-206, and based on the ratio of lead to uranium in these zircon crystals, the calculated radiometric age was 1.5 billion years. But helium escapes from these crystals very quickly, so if the crystals really were 1.5 billion years old, then essentially all of the helium should have escaped. So the large amounts of helium that were found indicate that the crystals can't be 1.5 billion years old, and maybe the transformation from uranium to lead-206 was faster in the past. A third assumption is that the rock has remained a closed system from the time of its formation. What that means is that no parent element or daughter element has been either added to or removed from the rock during its history by any number of potential chemical or physical processes. For radiometric dating to be valid, all of these assumptions must be true. If they are not, the results are not reliable.
And so I hope you heard that clearly. If those assumptions are violated, the results are not accurate. So here's some very common methods. Rubidium decays to strontium, uranium decays to lead, potassium decays to argon. There are, of course, others, but these are the three biggest ones. Now, again, as I stated earlier, radiometric dating methods are used to date igneous or metamorphic rocks. It cannot be used to date sedimentary rocks, limestone, sandstone, or shale. Again, looking at some common half-lives, these things are all very long. So if you have a small amount, any amount of daughter element, when the rock forms, when it cools, already you're giving the appearance of age. So it's important to understand that these assumptions are critical, and even the smallest violation in them can give the appearance of massive ages. But this is so potassium, the half-life converting to argon, potassium-40 to argon-40, 1.25 billion years. Rubidium-87 to strontium-87, 48.8 billion years. Thorium-232 to lead-208, 14 billion years. Uranium-235 to lead-207, 704 million years. And then uranium-238 to lead-206, 4.47 billion years. These are massive half-lives. And so again, a small violation can create massive age discrepancies. So radioisotope dating assumptions. The amount of the daughter element at the formation is 0. Absolutely required, or you're going to get the look of age automatically. All of the daughter element is due to radioactive decay. So again, when you measure that daughter element, if it's for any other reason, or if it was there at formation, would be another reason, then your dates are totally wrong. The sample was always in a closed environment. He talked about that. It's not contaminated through physical or mechanical processes that have altered either the parent or daughter elements, either increasing them or decreasing them. And then finally, the decay rate has always been constant. And there's growing evidence that that one is not true. And so already it looks like on the face that although this works in the laboratory, it doesn't work in real life. And that's where the problems really begin, because the problems go well beyond the theory. The theory seems to be sound. It's when you start looking into the associated problems that you find the real issues. For example, so I'm going to quote a lot of different articles and scientists, and what I'll do is just quote the lead researcher, but you have this if you want to go look these things up. This is Ren Sitilli, and he says, quote, as much as 80% of the potassium in a small sample of iron meteorite can be removed by distilled water in 4.5 hours. Again, potassium argon dating. Well, if you're removing the parent element, then you're changing the appearance of the age. Again, any process that can alter the parent or daughter element in this project, which is laying out in the open in the environment, will mess up all of the assumptions. I guess that's Dalrymple, basalt from Mount Etna, Sicily, that erupted in 122 BC. So we have visual confirmation. We have historical evidence of when it erupted. Gave a potassium argon age of 250,000 years old. It's not even 2,000 years old, where it was 2,000, I guess. But the point is, there's something going on here we don't understand. This is Funkhauser. Lava from the 1801 Hawaiian volcano eruption gave a potassium argon date of 1.6 million years old. Again, so we're talking about a couple of hundred years old, a few hundred years old, 400, and we're looking at a date of 1.6 million. Not even close. Basalt from Mount Kilauea Iki, the eruption in 1959, gave a potassium argon date of 8.5 million years old. Again, this is not even close. This thing was just a few years old. And so to give you how close, here's Sandy and Tori in the Iki crater, still smoking after an eruption 8.5 million years ago. But see, we know when that erupted. Basalt from Mount Etna, the eruption in 1964, gave a potassium argon age of 700,000 years. So these things are not even consistently off. They're just consistently wrong. This is basalt from Mount Etna, Sicily, the eruption in 1972, a potassium argon age of 350,000 years old. Sunset Crater. This is a volcano in Arkansas. That's, again, Sandy and Tori. It's known by tree ring dating to be about 1,000 years old. Now, again, tree ring dating is not that reliable. It's reasonable, but they do know for sure that you can have years where you get multiple rings. And equally, if it's a drought, you can miss getting a ring. But again, it's close enough for this discussion. But when that same area was potassium argon dated because it was a volcano flow, potassium argon dated at 200,000 years old. We're talking not even close, not even remotely close. Mount St. Helens, if you remember, in the 1980 eruption, immediately after that and prior to the eruption that started in 2004, a new lava dome began to form. And you can see it forming there in the crater. Here's the dates from that lava dome. Whole rock samples dated at 350,000 years old. Say feldspar, 340,000 years old. The next one, 900,000. The next one, 1.7 million. To finally pyroxene, the other sample, 2.8 million. Now this is the exact same rock taking out of that dome, that lava dome at Mount St. Helens that began to form following the first eruption. We know the date of that formation. It would be 1980 or later. And yet, when we date it, we get dates all over the place, ranging from 350,000 years old, which is not even close, to 2.8 million, which is just, again, it's amazing to me, the discrepancies with these dates. One of New Zealand's most active volcanoes is Mount, and I'll mess this up, Ngauruhoe, located in the center of New Zealand's North Island. It has erupted 70 times since 1975. RATE took 13 lava samples from the eruptions, 1949, 1954, and 1975. So they know the dates, and they sent those to Geochrome Laboratories in Cambridge, Massachusetts. The only information that the RATE project provided the lab was to conduct whole rock potassium argon dating, and that they were probably very young. So although the ages of the lava based on eyewitness testimony were between 25 and 51 years old, the 13 rock samples dated as followed. 4, 270,000, less than 270,000 years old. 1, less than 290,000 years old. 1, 800,000 years old. 3, 1 million years old. 1, 1.2 million. 1, 1.3 million. 1, 1.5 million. And 1, 3.5 million. And this is from Lubinau's book, Bones of Contention. Apollo moon samples were dated by both uranium, lead, and potassium argon methods, giving results that varied from 2 million to 28 billion years old. And this is David Minton. We're all familiar with the Grand Canyon. Lava flows from volcanoes on the north rim of the Grand Canyon, which erupted after its formation, show potassium argon dates a billion years older than the most ancient basement rocks at the bottom of the canyon. Again, this science is not working in the field. Equally, we're starting to get the idea that somehow the rock that is melted, there's something about that rock that is impacting the date as well. So first, before we break these two topics apart, I want to show you even a larger problem. So I've showed you the initial problem. The dates don't work in the field, but it's even worse than that. So at the end of this video, I want you to be paying close attention. We've got two. And I'm going to ask you, here's the question in advance, is a date of 1.75 million years old for this lava flow and the associated remains scientific? Is this science? That's going to be the question. I'll leave it to you to answer. So this is this DVD or video is Radiometric Backflips. It's from Creation Magazine Live. This is Richard Fangran and Calvin Smith from CMI.
Welcome to Creation Magazine Live. My name is Richard Fangrad.
And I'm Calvin Smith.
Now, our topic this week is radiometric backflips. How solid are these dates really? That's an interesting topic. Now, popular myth is that radioactive dating methods confirm the geologic timescale and the concept of human evolution. The methods appear so impressive that many Christians accept them as evidence that the Earth is very old. We're going to expose this myth today by doing a study of the dating of the East African KBS tuff strata and the famous fossil 1470, KNMER 1470. That stands for Kenyan National Museum, East Rudolph. Now you'll have to follow along carefully here to see all the evolutionary assumptions, but you'll get them. Just pay close attention.
Right. Richard Leakey, son of famed paleoanthropologist Louis and Mary Leakey, visited the fossil deposits east of Lake Rudolph, which is now Lake Turkana, in northern Kenya in 1967. He immediately organized an expedition to search for hominid fossils. That's what his family does. And the most important fossil discovered there is KNMER 1470. Skull 1470 is modern in appearance, but was originally estimated by Richard Leakey to be about 2.9 million years old.
Okay. One early geologist with Richard Leakey at East Rudolph was Kay Berensmeyer. Seeking to unravel the geology of the area, she discovered a volcanic layer of ash, or tuff, that became known as the Kay Berensmeyer site, the KBS tuff. If the KBS tuff were anywhere else, no one would give it a second thought. However, at East Rudolph, it is of utmost importance. First, human fossils and artifacts, tools, cannot usually be dated radiometrically. but they can be at the KBS tuff. It contains radioactive potassium-40, which decays into argon-40. Second, artifacts have been found in association with the KBS tuff.
Right. So the assumption is that the tuff gives an estimate of the age of the stone tools found there, right? Yep. So third, hundreds of Homo and Australopithecine fossils have been found above and below the KBS tuff. So the date of the tuff becomes a maximum age for fossils found above it and a minimum for fossils below it. Now, the first attempt to date the KBS tuff was in 1969, well before the discovery of the skull, 1470.
Right.
Richard Leakey supplied rock samples to F.J. Fitch from Birkbeck College and University of London and J.A. Miller from Cambridge University, both recognized authorities in potassium-argon dating. Now, Fitch and Miller's first analysis gave evolutionary dates from 212 to 230 million years of age.
Oh, dear.
Concerning this, they said, from these results, it was clear that an extraneous argon age discrepancy was present. Well, wait a sec. I thought you tossed this stuff in a machine and whatever it came out to be, that's what the date was. How did they know there was a problem? Well, the associated fossils told them that there was a problem.
So, in spite of our being assured that dating methods constitute independent confirmation of evolutionary dates, associated fossils had already determined the acceptable date ranges, and the dates fell outside of those ranges, and because of that, they were considered wrong.
Right.
Now, based on their alleged evolution, the Australopithecine and other mammalian fossils found beneath the KBS tuff had determined that the rocks should be between 2 and 5 million years old. So dates of 212 to 230 million years were way off. Without the associated fossils, however, there would be no way for an evolutionary geologist to know if the dates were good dates or bad dates. Big problem here.
Yeah.
Under other circumstances and without fossils to guide them, evolutionary geologists could have accepted those dates as good.
Right, they would have been fact, so to speak.
Yeah.
Fitch and Miller requested new samples. From these, they concluded from pumice lumps and feldspar crystals that the age of the KBS tuff was 2.61 million years.
Wow.
It was because Leakey found skull 1470 below this tuff after it had been dated at 2.61 million years and above rock dated at 3.18 million years that he estimated that the skull was then 2.9 million years old. So you can see how evolutionary assumptions can overrule so-called absolute dating methods.
Yeah, that one's easy to see.
That one's very easy to see. We're going to show you some more examples of that. But people need to get out of their head that, oh, well, the scientists said it, it must be fact. And more when we come back.
So the KBS tuff. In 1969, via potassium-argon dating, the tuff is dated 212 to 230 million years old. This date is rejected because it does not fit the evolutionary model of the species and their supposed evolutionary time frame. Now keep in mind, they haven't found the human fossil yet. They've just found Australopithecine fossils as well as other mammals. So automatically, based on their understanding of the geologic column and their understanding of the evolution of these different animals, this date is rejected when it would otherwise have been received. New samples are taken and they date 2 to 5 million years old, although that's a massive difference, I would say. They do some other different types of samples and that's the range they get. And so keep in mind, as you think about this, it seems settled. Although it's a wide range, this is 2 to 5 million years old for the KBS tuft. Now keep in mind, at this point, we haven't found that Homo skull yet, the genus Homo skull. It hasn't been found. But just understand, so we've moved from 212 to 230 million to 2.5, and we're locked in, and that is the answer. That's our final answer. Okay, so this next video clip, we pick back up the discussion with Richard Fangrad and Calvin Smith about the KBS tuft.
Right. In 1972, before Skull 1470 was announced, Vincent Maglio from Princeton University published in Nature a chronology of the hominid-bearing sediments east of Lake Rudolph, which included the KBS tuft that we've been talking about here. His work was based on the lineages of 2 species of pig and 1 of elephant. Now, Maglio's dates were compatible with the radiometric date arrived at by Fitch and Miller of 2 to 5 million years old, something like that, and were considered to confirm their date. In 1974, a third chronology of the area was published in Nature based on paleomagnetism. The conclusion was 2.7 to 3 million years old. And that seemed to represent a bullseye for the correlation of various dating methods. So here's a bit more information.
Right. So by late 1974, the KBS tuff had been dated 5 different times by 4 different dating methods. The alleged compatibility of the different methods would seem to be like a geologist's dream, right? However, under the surface, Skull 1470, with its estimated age of 2.9 million years, presented the evolutionary world with an intolerable situation here.
Right. The theory of human evolution did not allow for a skull so modern to be that old. Nevertheless, Richard Leakey continued to fight for his original date. If Skull 1470 was 2.9 million years old, then he had discovered the oldest member of the genus Homo. If it wasn't, he hadn't.
Right.
Hence, he resisted lowering the age of the skull.
Right, he wanted the kudos for...
Absolutely.
So, meanwhile, another study by G.H. Curtis and his associates from the University of California, Berkeley, claimed to distinguish 2 tuff units. One gave an age of 1.6 million years, and the other, where Skull 1470 was found, gave 1.82 million years, both considerably younger than the 5 previous studies had reported. Right?
Okay, all of the previously cited articles spoke of the great difficulty in getting rock or crystal samples that were not altered, weathered, or derived from older rock. The question arises, the question comes up here, how does one know when one has good samples for dating? Well, the answer seems to be that good samples give dates in accordance with evolutionary presuppositions. Bad samples give dates not in conformity with evolution. This is the classic case of circular reasoning here. This is what we're talking about.
Of course. On March 20th, 1980, 2 more dating studies in Nature criticized the earlier work and claimed that the age of the KBS tuff was 1.87 or 1.89 million years. Then, in late 1981, Ian McDougall published his study of the KBS tuff, giving a date of 1.88 million years. At that point, the 10-year controversy over the date of the KBS tuff came to a close with agreement on the more recent date.
Okay. Although the dating of the KBS tuff appeared to have been settled in 1980 and 81 by conformity of different dating methods, the controversy was actually settled in 1975 by the pigs.
That's right. Donald Johansen tells of attending the 1975 Bishop Conference on Anthropology and Geology in London. A major paper was presented by Basil Cook from Dalhousie University in Halifax, who'd studied the pig sequences in southern Ethiopia, at Hadar in Ethiopia, and at Olduvai Gorge in Tanzania. According to Cook, the dating at Lake Turkana, formerly Lake Rudolph, was too high by about 800,000 years. The pigs at Turkana told him so.
Okay. Donald Johansen is the paleoanthropologist made famous for discovering Lucy, in case you don't know that name. He wrote of this conference, he said this: nearly everyone but the Lake Turkana team, that would be Richard Leakey and his associates, went away convinced that the KBS tuff and Skull 1470 dates would have to be corrected.
Right. Not Leakey, though, because he wanted,
Right, not Leakey. So.
But the astounding thing about the whole affair was that the anthropologists were rejecting the same objective scientific data that they universally appealed to.
Yeah.
There was internal consistency within the studies and high conformity by 5 different dating techniques. The main thing the dates did not conform to was the concept of evolution of pigs and humans, not their own system. So we'll be back and talk more about this in a moment.
Okay, so the KBS tuft. In 1972, pig lineage studies date that tuft to 2 to 5 million years old. By 74, 5 different studies with 4 different dating methods have now conformed to a date or confirmed a date more along the lines of 2.7 to 3 million years old. Then the problem. They find the human skull and it cannot be 3 million years old. And it's underneath the tuft, so it's at least 3 million. Then in early 1980, 2 different tufts, ash, are identified, and they're dated at 1.6 and 1.82 million years old. And you can see the age now coming down and coming into conformity. In 1980, two more studies, 1.87 and 1.89 million. And then in 1981, one more study at 1.88 million. And there, it's settled. The tough dates around 1.75 to 1.85 million years old. Now, is this scientific? This is unreal. And what ultimately settled it was not any date. What ultimately settled was their supposed evolution of pigs and elephants. O'Rourke said it this way, quote, "The rocks do date the fossils, but the fossils date the rocks more accurately." Now, let that sink in. The supposed and believed dates, whether it's fossils of humans or fossils of various animals, and where they believe they are in the evolutionary time frame, which is not supported anywhere, it's completely made up of whole cloth, date the rocks better than the rocks do the fossils. Now, from this, I hope you see three obvious observations. The first one, if the date fits the evolutionary model, they accept it. They are good with any dates that match the presupposition they're showing up with, where they believe this should be in the evolutionary time scale, in their supposed geologic column or the evolution of man, in the supposed evolution of man. If the date does not fit the model, they reject it. In some cases, they'll reject it outright. In some cases, they'll footnote it with an explanation of why it cannot be right, but they reject it. Now, often, we date things that we know the ages of and get incorrect dates. But then we go and date the ages of things that we have no idea how old they are, and we believe those dates are correct. This is not science. But now let's talk about the geologic column, because it came up in the evolution of man and the evolution of pigs, as you saw that last presentation. So the geological column and the supposed evolution of man are theoretical classification systems for the layers of rocks and fossils that make up the Earth's crust. Some falliferous layers can often be traced across the entire continents and correlated with rocks in other countries. In such cases, these layers have been given names and even assigned dates, so that when you find stuff in this layer, you know what date it is. Equally, when you find animals within any layer that are that are index animals, then you date the layer based on the evolutionary idea of when that thing lived. This is completely circular reason. So we never got a true date for when Tyrannosaurus Rex lived, when he came on the scene and when he went extinct. We've made up those dates, and now when we find him, we say this strata conforms to that date. And we're doing the exact same thing with primate and human fossils. We've set dates for these different, when we find one of these skulls that fits into one of these groups, we've assigned these dates arbitrarily, and then everything we find in that strata now falls to within that date range. And when we find something in a strata that's completely outside that date range, then we spend years continuing to massage and milk the date range to move it to where we believe it should be, as you saw in the KBS Tough. Now, as you think about the geological column, so fossils are most often dated by their position in the geologic column or their supposed position in the evolution of man's story, but rarely with any dating methods. So as you think about the geologic column, as you think about these different dinosaurs, or as we move even older into Cambrian and even before that, trilobites and supposed earlier life forms, where did these dates come from? That is a fantastic question. Where did those dates come from? Well, in James Hutton in 1726 to 1797, in 1795, began to put together the first geologic column. Charles Lyell, who lived 1797 to 1895, expanded on Hutton's work and assigned dates to the 12 layers of the column. He used this information in the first and probably the most popular book on the principles of geology, which he published in 1830. And there's James Hutton and Charles Lyell. Lyell and others worked out the strata dates in the early 19th century before very much was known about rock strata and their fossils. Strata in England, Scotland, and France were the primary ones they studied, and Lyell based his age theory on the number of still living species represented by the fossils in each strata. So he's projecting back arbitrarily how much change it would have taken to get to what he believes is the living species of that now dead species. This is completely arbitrary. It has since been established that Lyell's theory does not agree with reality. The percentage of still living species is very, very high throughout all strata. And the stratum itself varies from place to place, and even the order varies at times. So we will find things where we think this thing died off and then this thing came to life later, and it'll be reversed in the strata. The supposed timeline of the evolution of man is an ever-changing, ever-ebbing, and flowing, bizarre science project that is preposterous to watch. It is the exact same thing as the geologic column, except it's with just the evolution or supposed evolution of man. If you haven't checked out that video, please watch the video on the supposed evolution of man. Also, as you saw in the KBS Tough video, the dates also come from evolutionary ideas about the descent of man or other animals. So at the end of the day, it's these evolutionary dates that reset any date they may have received through any radiometric dating method. So it's important for us to understand that the geologic column and the supposed evolution of man are made up with no real evidence to support them, no carbon-14 dating, no radiometric dating, and they drive the dates. They reset radiometric dates. This is circular reasoning at its best. O'Rourke went on to say this: radiometric dating would not have been feasible if the geologic column had not first been erected. This is Agar. Quote, ever since William Smith at the beginning of the 19th century, fossils have been and still are the best and most accurate method of dating and correlating the rocks in which they occur. Again, the supposed evolution of these animals and the estimates connected to that supposed evolution are still the best and most accurate method. Now, this is a made-up system that's now resetting dates that we receive from various radiometric methods. This is circular reasoning. Agar, apart from very modern examples, which are really archaeology, I can think of no cases of radioactive decay being used to date fossils. And if you think about the KBS Tough, at the end of the day, it didn't even do it there. Hayatsu. In conventional interpretation of potassium-argon data, it is common to discard ages which are substantially too high or too low compared with the rest of the group or with other available data such as the geological time scale. In other words, if it doesn't match the geological time scale, we just throw it out. We just chunk it. If it's too high or too low, we throw it away. So here we are in the 21st century, slave to a made-up, in the 19th century, geologic column. Now, as you think about this, I do want to talk about just one guy in the geologic column. He was an index fossil. His name, it says lobe-fin fish there. The lobe-fin fish they're referring to in this little diagram is actually a fish called the coelacanth. Now, I realize that looks like coelacanth, but it is the coelacanth. So let me tell you about the coelacanth. So this lobe-fin fish, coelacanth, was taught for many years as one of the direct descendants from the event when fish crawled out of the oceans and started living on land. So this coelacanth with these like foot-like, leg-like, clubfoot-like fins was the first fish to convert to a land vertebrate. He is heralded as proof of transition from a fish, to land, a land vertebrate, and he was designated as an index fossil. Now, index fossils are assigned supposed dates based on these made-up observations. Again, all circular reasoning, but the coelacanth fossil was assigned the dates of 330 million when they see him coming on the scene to 80 million when he went extinct. So if you find rock layers, this was what they believed, and you found a coelacanth, you knew that rock layer was between 80 million and 330 million years old. Now, this was held as scientific fact until 1938, when the first specimen of a coelacanth was found being sold in a fish market in South Africa. Keep in mind, up until this time, we believe the coelacanth that crawled out of the water, not we, but modern evolutionary scientists, that he had crawled out of the water some 330 million years ago, began to live on the land, and slowly became a lizard, and he went extinct 80 million years ago. That was until we saw people who were catching them and eating them. And so now the truth is, if you want to see a coelacanth, you can. There's one. In fact, if you would like to go swimming with the coelacanth, you can. In fact, if you want to buy a baby coelacanth and raise him in your aquarium, you can. This index fossil, when found in the strata, proved that strata was between 80 and 330 million years old. That was until we found him alive. The exact same thing is going on with human evolution. All we have here is, outside of Homo habilis, Homo erectus, Homo sapiens, ancient Homo sapiens, Neanderthals, modern Homo sapiens, all humans. Homo habilis and all the Australopithecines, all primates. This is not an evolutionary timescale. This is two different species being mingled together to give the appearance of transition when there is none. Now, there are two places where you can find all the layers of the geologic column in perfect order. You probably know those places. The first, in our textbooks. The second, on the internet. Equally, there are two places where you can find the timeline for the supposed evolution of man in perfect order. In our biology textbooks and on the internet. Now, what we're rarely told, if rocks are even dated, the dates are accepted or rejected based on how they compare to the geologic column or the evolutionary theory around that species, whether it's man, pig, elephant, whatever. That's the truth. On the face, this is shocking. But more shocking is how quick supposed absolute ages are rejected to accept a new absolute age. But this is really the tip of the iceberg. In this short video, we've barely scratched the surface of the sheer volumes of examples of how bankrupt this process is. Equally, there's evidence that in some cases, the apparent age of rock has a lot to do with the source rock that was melted or that was created from. We really don't understand this science in the field. It works correct in the lab, but this whole idea, what happens in the field, we're certain that rocks are being created with daughter element present. There's no doubt about that now. Equally, there's strong evidence. There's things that can happen that vary the decay rate. And then equally, there's evidence that the source rock that was melted has a lot to do with the age of the newly formed rock. And that's really the true story. This is an unreliable method, unfortunately. Now, the last time I taught about this topic, I called the lesson the dating game. You can imagine why. This is a game. And the game is just played and worked out until we get to the age for this particular fossil or this particular item that we want, and then we secure the game. The Bible is clear. In 6 days, Yahweh made heaven and earth, the sea, and all that is in them. He made everything. He created the heavens. He created the sun. He created our moon. He created all the stars, the current estimate being 200 sextillion. He created all of them. And everything that's lived on this planet, short of microevolution, as things pick up different attributes, just being passed along where that attribute is favored. And he rested on the seventh day. Therefore, Yahweh blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. I would argue that we have been hoodwinked on this whole issue of radiometric dating, and it cannot be trusted because it does not work when we date things that we know the age of. And we're starting to see, we have so many examples, it's almost breathtaking. So that's all I have to say for our time together today. I would encourage you, I'm going to try to do another video on carbon-14 dating. Obviously, some of the same concerns with carbon-14 dating, but not nearly as extreme. So until we meet in Sunday school class, God bless you, and hopefully this helped answer the question, what about all these old dates that I'm hearing about? God bless y'all.